Good afternoon, welcome back. This afternoon, I would like to just very simply introduce this session, reminding you that this is about social protection, and we'll look at the different aspects and roles of social protection, not only as a sector, but as a tool to actually reduce inequalities. We'll look at social protection as a set of schemes, as requirements to understand where is social protection needed, the requirements for data, and the links of social protections with other sectors, other thematics. We have seen quite a number of those already this week. You were there in the sessions about fiscal policies. There were also clearly links made with our colleagues with the health sector yesterday, and the need to have a social protection scheme for affordability of healthcare. So a number of aspects will be covered today. We'll have four guest speakers presenting. Dr. Stephen Kidd from the Social CSO Development Pathways as a social policy specialist. We'll have Soyum Kim from the OECD Development Center talking to us about the Gini coefficients on the pre and post-tax and transfers. So looking again at issues of secondary incomes and impact of social protection on informal economy. We'll have an intervention from Guillermo Montt at the ILO Social Protection Center for South Latin America, talking to us on an example with Paraguay. And we'll have interventions from Ms. Okada from ESCAP at the UN, also providing examples of tools that can be used to understand the impact of specific social protection policies and schemes on inequalities. So a very packed session, and therefore I will stop it here and give the floor back to Alba Royobo from Unit G4 in charge of social protection. Alba, over to you.
Good afternoon to everybody. If you go to the second slide, Jérôme. So the aim,
yes,
Jérôme will project the presentation, but I will refer to the aim of this session. This is a session on social protection and inequality, and we've conceived this session as a conceptual discussion, but also landed in country and region realities. We have, as Jérôme was saying, two panels, and the idea is to respond to three main questions. The first is, what does the inequality angle bring to the debate on social protection as compared with more traditional propor approaches? The second is, what is the role for social protection in the reduction of inequalities? And the third is how to maximize the impact on inequalities reduction of social protection policies and programs. As Jérôme was saying, we have four panelist speakers. The first, Stephen Kidd, will refer a lot of how to reduce inequalities through universal social protection. Soyum Kim from the OECD Development Center will also elaborate on how this plays out in developing economies that are largely informal, with the challenges that this entails. Then Sayuri Okada from ESCAP, from the UN ESCAP, will present a microsimulation model showing the impact of social protection can have an inequality, and she will also look at the different policy options. And Guillermo Montt from ILO Paraguay, as Jérôme was saying, will try to bring down this conceptual framework in how you implement it at the country level. Just before I start, it's maybe important to maybe set the concept of social protection, because many of the participants today may not be dealing with social protection as such. So we will put forward our understanding of social protection for this session and within DG INTPA. Social protection is mainly composed, in our understanding and a broad definition, about four main categories. The first being social assistance. This is non-contributory social protection, which is composed by social transfers, public work programs, fee waivers. The second is social insurance. This is contributory social protection, that is providing support in the event of contingencies. This can be illness, injury, maternity, paternity, unemployment, old age, disability, death. The third pillar would be the access to social care services. This is a broad range of social welfare services that many times is included in the broad definition of social protection. And the fourth is the pillar on active labor market policies, which is also very usually included in social protection definition. This is training, this is support for job seeking, job matching, etc. This next slide, here you can see a map on where we are active as the DG INTPA in social protection worldwide. I will not go into the details, but the important thing is that even before the COVID and compared to the last MFF, social protection has been selected in more MIPS in more countries than in the last financial period. Now we are active in social protection or social protection components in more or less 37 INPA countries, 43 countries with southern neighborhood. And in the next slide, the bulk you see it's Sub-Saharan Africa, followed by Latin America and some in Asia. And the following slide shows a graph where where do we focus more, in which kind of topics we focus more when implementing social protection programs. And the important thing is that most of our projects and programs have a strong focus on system strengthening. And that's not by chance, that is because it's the policy line of INTPA, and this has been adopted when the communication on social protection was approved in 2012. And since then, we've been implementing this perspective. Now I pass to the next slide on what is the role for social protection in the reduction of inequalities. It is increasingly recognized that market-led growth alone is not enough to achieve sustainable development, and that redistribution has a positive impact on the economy and societies. And it's in that context that social protection has a strong role, because social protection is per se a redistributive tool. It can be in the forms of transfers, it can be cash transfers, it can be in kind transfers in the broader definition that I was referring to. But social protection helps then reduce inequality through different effects. The first is the direct effect of redistribution of transfers. The second is that it also contributes to equality of opportunities, because income security and increased access to quality social services allow for higher investment in human capital. Social protection gives households this extra income that they can use in education, in health, in nutrition, or even in increased access to basic services, to active labor market policies, etc. Another effect is that thanks to social protection, you can enhance risk-taking. Social protection transfers can enable lower income households to save and invest, innovating and taking risks that could open the doors for higher income in the future. Another effect is that social protection also plays an important role in context of crisis. This was visible during COVID-19, when people's livelihoods are threatened, and guaranteeing a minimum income let people maintain a standard, decent standard of living, but also to continue investing in capacities. But also regarding the economy, the purchasing power of cash transfers invigorates domestic demand and also smooths consumption during economic downturns. The fifth effect that we've identified is that social protection is not only meant to tackle individual vulnerabilities, but is also a socioeconomic stabilizer that can support economy's transformation and transitions, ensuring that they are just and that they leave no one behind. That is very clear for intra-EU policy, and we can think about the Just Transition Mechanism or the historical European Social Fund. We have to now make the point for also the external agenda, no? And I'm of course referring to the global gateway and the opportunities for social protection within this framework that we see in three main, let's say, pillars. The first is that social protection can ensure that investments in green and digital transitions are more fair, because it can help in harnessing the human capital needed. Also because it can mitigate the potential negative effects that these transitions have on income and jobs. And also it can ensure that the jobs created are decent. And the last point that is actually very important, but I wanted to mention it at the end, and is that social protection is not only important for inequality on quantitative or economic terms. Social protection is also crucial for reinforcing the social contract. This is the trust in government, This is the sense of belonging, and this is the solidarity considerations that should always be in our minds. Next slide. I will not go into detail in this graph because many of the speakers I think will, but very quickly, this is a graph taken from the ILO World Social Protection Report. And what you see here is actually the impact of social protection for reducing income inequality as it supports redistribution. You see the comparison between the levels of pre-taxes and transfers inequality in different economies, measured by Gini, with the levels of inequality in disposable incomes, post-taxes and transfers. The first is the whole bars with the blue-green bars, and the disposable incomes, you see it in the green bars that show lower levels of inequality. Basically, you can see clearly that countries with more developed social protection systems, you don't see the names, but they are Sweden on the left, Sweden, Belgium, Ireland, have a much more significant degree of redistribution and then reduced level of inequalities that social protection systems in countries where they have like lower social protection schemes. In the right part, you see Egypt, Colombia, Paraguay, and Cote d'Ivoire. And still, these are mid-income countries, but or lower mid-income countries. But there's something else that you see there, and it's difference between the effect on transfers and on taxes. On transfer is the dark blue bar, and in taxes, sorry, is the light blue bar. And what you see is that the redistribution effect is higher for the transfers than for the taxes. Actually, I know that the OECD made some aggregate analysis on this, looking at 120 countries, and they came to the conclusion that around 73% of the variation in income redistribution worldwide is explained by the level of public social protection spending. Next slide, and there's only 2 to go. But okay, the story is not that easy, and things are more complicated, and I will refer to some elements. The first is that even if social protection is a distributive or redistributive instrument per se, that doesn't mean that there's different social protection schemes that have diverse distributional impact. And this distributional impact can be progressive, neutral, or even regressive. That means that it can even lead to increased inequality. I put some examples. Social insurance is usually limited to a formal sector, which is usually very small in the countries where we work and better off. So it would be regressive for the general budget of a country to support only social insurance, let's say contributive pensions, or for a development program to focus only on social insurance undermining social assistance. Another example can be the subsidies. Energy subsidies are traditional regressive, basically favoring the car and energy consuming parts of the population that are actually not the one in most need. Or we can think about other dimensions of inequality. For instance, conditional cash transfers can undermine gender equality because they put some conditionalities that can increase the burden of unpaid and domestic work for women. So these are all things that we have to take into account. And the best thing also to have a clear idea of what is happening with the inequality effects of social protection is to look at the whole fiscal cycle. So not looking at the transfers alone, but also looking at what is happening with the taxes and always prioritizing progressive taxation. The third thing that Stephen Kidd will develop better than I is that progressivity does not mean poverty targeting, which is maybe counterintuitive, but actually targeting the poor in many cases does not imply like increased level of equalities, and that's for various reasons. It's because poverty is not a static status, it's a dynamic condition, so there's a lot of exclusion errors. Also, poverty rates in many countries are so large that it's actually less relevant to target only the poor, and we usually say it's easier to identify the rich than to target the poor. There's also this missing middle effect. So social protection systems in many low-income countries are actually stronger on the extremes of the income scale. So the social assistance for the poorest and the social insurance for the better off, but then you have a strong missing middle in the middle of the income scale. And finally, because social protection schemes are not introduced in a vacuum. They imply higher expenditures, is true, and these require higher levels of taxation that imply redistributive effects across the population. So, and this is to say, because we have to find a reconciliatory language between the bottom 40% wording that it's in the SDG target 10.1, and also it has been retained in the inequality marker, and universality. And maybe a good way out, as the development pathways put it, is that we don't need to target maybe the vulnerable, we need to make sure to reach the vulnerable. And the last point is that in any case, ultimately, social protection schemes, or the choice among social protection schemes, is a political choice. So we have to see that also countries have the choice between a race to the bottom. We are in a moment of pervasive informality. We have the new forms of work, weakened labor institutions, privatization of public services, or we can support them in taking what the ILO calls also the high road for progressively building universal social protection systems, which demands, of course, higher level of taxation with the wealthier members of the society. So just the last slide very quickly. This is some conclusions of recommendations. The first is that we have to support a political consensus around social protection. This is anchoring social protection in a right-based foundation. We think about constitutions, the legislative frameworks, but also ensuring that we have a strong political support, which can be ensured with social dialogue. The second is what I was saying, to build a systems approach so that we avoid fragmentation, exclusion, errors, and overlaps. That we opt for universality. I was explaining why before. The fourth is that every time that we support social protection, we also need to look at the taxation part. And the taxation part, I'm speaking quite broadly, is DRM through progressive taxation, shifting from taxing consumption to taxing personal income and capital gains. We saw this 2 days ago in the fiscal session, and also looking at PFM. It's not an easy discussion, we know, but the delegations actually have an added value as compared with other development partners, especially when it comes to budget support, because they have in the same table the ministries of finance, the ministries of social protection. They can put specific indicators. And just to say that we know that it's difficult to measure, but there's some tools there. We saw 2 days ago the Equity Institute methodology for assessing the impact on poverty and inequality of different fiscal policy instruments. There's also the ISPA tools that we've been supporting as INTPA. And they have different tools, but there's, for instance, the RAP tool that can coast social protection scenarios. Then there's other tools that can actually see how to secure funding for these scenarios. And all these tools are available. And we are, as DG INTPA, happy to put you through the development partners that are actually using and know how to use these methodologies. The last 3 points. So let's also see at social protection in a broader framework of the decent work agenda. So also promoting job-rich macroeconomic policies. Also make the investment case, as I was saying. Let's also think of social protection for investments within the global gateway strategy. And finally, let's support MIS, management information systems, that go beyond registries for social protection beneficiaries and allow to collect disaggregated data. This is on income, on wealth, across individuals and households, rural, urban, across population groups. And in an ideal world, this information can also serve for non-economic determinants, such as to analyze the dynamics of exclusion from social capital, or also the political participation. So thanks a lot. I hand back the floor to Jerome for the rest of the speakers.
Jerome, I think you're muted.
You're muted,
Yes,
Jerome.
thank you very much, Alba. I was presenting but being muted, so that's a bit confusing for my brain this afternoon. So thanks for that panoramic introduction, extremely useful and interesting. I don't want to delay anyone because we have interesting sessions coming up. So please, Dr. Keats, would you like to take the floor and share your presentation? You may be on mute. Let me see, because we don't.
Yeah, sorry, are you able to see the presentation?
Yes, we
Yes,
see very well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. So thanks. It's great to be invited to this. And I really just want to look at one topic, because I think, as Alba mentioned, is counterintuitive, is what's the most effective means of reducing inequality through social security. Actually, I prefer the term social security, social protection, but I don't have time to get into that. Is it through means testing or universality? Because this is a critical question in the areas that we work, is to understand, are we actually strengthening measures to reduce inequality or actually undermining measures through the design of our schemes? So this, put simplistically, the way that social security works in reducing inequality through a combination of taxation and transfers can be illustrated in this way. This is just a very simple sort of diagram of a distribution of wealth in a country. Most countries, they look very similar to this, from the poorest to on the left to the richest on the right. You can see this kind of distribution, with the rich doing much better off than the most of the population. And what we try to do through by investing in social security is to kind of flatten the curve away, to get something more like this green curve, where we can increase incomes amongst the majority, and that will be mainly done through the transfers, and we would have incomes falling among a minority of those who are better off, mainly through the tax system. And this way, by flattening the curve, we're reducing inequality. So let's look at some examples and how in some of the evidence around whether means tested or universal schemes are more effective. First, I'd like to look at sort of OECD countries and using OECD data to see what are the impacts of different levels of investment in social security on reductions in inequality, taking higher levels of expenditure as a proxy for a more universal system. So here we can see along the bottom, the absolute redistribution, the sort of impacts on inequality that we have. So the further to the right, the greater the reduction in inequality, and then the expenditure on the y-axis. So the higher up you are, the more you spend. So what we find is what we find in some of the countries that are much lower levels of spending, we find minimal impacts. Turkey, Chile, Mexico, Republic of Korea, at the time they had much more dependence on poverty targeted or means tested schemes. If we go further up, we can find the sort of Anglo-Saxon countries tend to be grouped around the sort of middle, where there's more of a mix between universal and means tested schemes. So they have a greater reduction on inequality, but not as large as we'd find in many EU countries, which are sort of grouped around this area, where we have much higher levels of expenditure on much more universal systems, both social insurance and tax financed systems, and therefore much greater impacts on inequality, suggesting, as we might expect in richer countries, that the more universal systems have much greater impacts on inequality. So what's the evidence if we look around low and middle income countries? So we've done some research on this in a number of countries, and I just want to present some of the results. This is the example on the left here from Georgia. Georgia is a country that spends 6% of GDP on tax financed social security. It's mainly, most spending is on a universal old age pension, also has a universal disability benefit and a means tested household benefit. Now, this graph is showing the change in consumption that you get when you take into account the transfers that people receive and the tax that they pay to finance those schemes. So the change in consumption, if you see the orange line, is zero. That's where there's no change in consumption at the zero. That's the baseline. And if you look at this green line, we see the blue line, which shows the change in consumption, crosses over from positive on the left to negative on the right. So amongst the poorest 70% of the population, they're net winners when you take into account transfers and taxes. And particularly amongst the very poorest, they're the biggest winners in this universal system of or more universal system of Georgia. And then the top 30%, they're sort of net funders. They pay more in tax than they receive in the benefits, and it's the richest who are paying the high, who have the biggest reductions in consumption. More or less what we would want to see from a social security system. If you compare this though with a means tested system, such as the Philippines, which only spends 0.4% of GDP, spends it mainly on two means tested household means tested household benefit, a conditional cash transfer, and an old age pension that's means tested as well. You can see the blue line, there's hardly any change. It has minimal impacts, the poverty targeted schemes on inequality. And if I put in the orange line, you can see it almost, it's very difficult to see any change, any crossover. The actual reductions in inequality from these two systems are a 16%, almost a 17% reduction in Gini in Georgia, which is a very significant reduction, but only 0.2% reduction in the Gini coefficient in the Philippines. Very, very minimal change as a result of targeting the poorest members of society. And interestingly, this conditional cash transfer program has been shown in a World Bank study to actually increase stunting amongst non-beneficiary children by 11 percentage points. That's because of a distortion in prices on high protein foods, but I don't have time to get into that. But this means tested programs can cause a lot of damage to households in different ways. If we look at another example of a range of other countries in Asia, we can look at blue countries, which are more means-tested systems, and the orange countries, which are more universal systems, although there's a mix in most countries. And you can look at the reduction in the Gini coefficient, therefore the reduction in inequality. We find the biggest reductions in Mongolia, which has quite universal system around old age, disability, and child benefits. But when you look, just to take an example of South Asia, it's interesting to compare where we see the blue generally has minimal impacts on inequality through the means-tested systems. But when you look at South Asia and you compare Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, which all have a kind of means-tested system, and you compare with Nepal, which has a much more universal system of social security, you can see much greater impacts also in Nepal, despite it being the poorest country in the region. And again, going back to Georgia, just to see the impacts of different schemes within Georgia, you can see the means-tested household benefit has an impact on inequality of only 3.5%. The two universal schemes have combined a much bigger impact, particularly the old age benefit reaching about almost 15% of GDP. The lower impact of the disability benefit is because there's much lower levels of spending compared to the targeted benefit because of the lower numbers of recipients. So the challenge that we find in many then low-income countries, or lower middle-income countries now, and the reasons why we find such few impacts in many countries is because there's still the model of social security that is being promoted and pushed in many countries is still one that I would call a poor relief model, based on the sort of 19th century model that we used in Europe, a long time ago, that we've moved away from, and where it provides a sort of benefits to the very poorest, these poor relief benefits targeted through means testing, and social insurance benefits for those in the formal economy, a large missing middle, as we've heard about, of people still on very low incomes and very precarious incomes in the informal economy. And these systems do not generate major impacts on inequality, to a large extent because they're missing out on the majority of the population in the middle, where we also want redistribution to be benefiting them. And on top of that, the poor relief schemes that we find globally have very high levels of exclusion. So in general, most means-tested schemes in low middle income countries tend to exclude over 50% of their intended recipients. So they're not even very good in delivering what they're trying to do anyway. The best targeted scheme is in Brazil, the old Bolsa Familia program, which had a 44% exclusion area, which you can find on conditional cash transfers globally, some of them well known. In Indonesia, 82% exclusion. In Pakistan, another well-known household benefit, means tested benefit, 73% exclusion. And in Georgia, the program we were just talking about has 53% exclusion. Whereas universal schemes, the evidence shows, tend to reach almost everybody that they're trying to reach. And we find then, as a result of these targeted schemes, that generally when we look at the levels of expenditure on social security in many low and middle income countries, and this is a list for which we have some reliable data, you find that most of them are investing much less than 1% of GDP. Compare it to OECD countries, where the average level of investment on both insurance and tax financing is around 12% of GDP. Many are well below that. That's not going to have very much impact on inequality at all. There's only a few countries that are spending a lot more. And the question is, how do, if we really want to address inequality and tackle inequality, how do we get more countries up to, say, 2% of GDP or 3% of GDP in their expenditures so that we see the greater impacts? And the way to do that is to move away from this 19th century poor relief model that has been pushed, but often by many donors in low and middle income countries, to a more social security model based on the right to social security for everybody, that it combines a combination of social insurance and tax finance schemes that reach everybody in a sort of multi-tiered model. And that's the challenge that we need to see in countries now. You know, and what we find in high income countries, and increasingly in some countries that are moving towards a more inclusive or universal model, is a commitment to building systems that address the risks that we face across the life cycle. So countries, as we find in Europe, often put in place child benefits for those of working age, more unemployment, sickness, parental benefits, disability benefits for persons with disability of any age, and old age pensions on a universal basis to support everybody. But the key sort of benefits that we find, where they find the largest levels of investment in both high income and low income and middle income countries, are around sort of child benefits, disability benefits, and old age pensions. So is it feasible to move to a more universal system in low and middle income countries that can have the kind of impacts that we want to see on inequality? So let's just look at an example of India. How might this play out in India if we were to try to introduce a system, a universal social security system over, say, the next 15 years, so that we can start with a small cost and increase the cost over time? And what this is, the model I'll be showing here is a model in which we then start an old age pension at a high age of 75 years and gradually reduce to 65 years. A disability benefit starting with those with most severe disabilities and then broaden into those with more moderate disabilities. And child benefits starting with children at a young age, in this case, 0 to 3 years of age, which would then reach all children. Don't take any children off and reach children 0 to 17 over time. Now, the transfer values that I put here, the $34 for adults and $11 for children, are based on the sort of median level of transfer that we find globally measured as a percentage of GDP per capita. To compare it to India's current system, in India, in its old age pension and disability benefits, currently provides only $2.50 a month. So way less than we find in the proposals here. Very minimal amount that's done. So what would this cost if we were to introduce it over time, sort of gradually? It would cost around a mere sort of 0.3% of GDP if it was to start in 2023, the kind of system that we're modeling. By 2040, the cost would only be 2% of GDP, still very small compared to high income countries. The average annual increase would only be 0.1% of GDP, so very easy for a country like India to increase the spending on that. And let's bear in mind that Nepal, a country with a more universal system, is already spending 1.6% of GDP. So it shouldn't be that difficult for India, a country like India, to catch up, given that it's a much wealthier country than Nepal. Who would this reach, this more universal system? We look here from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right, and all of those under the blue line are those who are in each percentile of those who are reached. We find the overall that 82% of households would eventually be reached in 2040 by this more universal system. It would be very popular. It would also be very shock responsive, because it would be easy just to, under a shock, to just increase transfer values to 80% of households. And the highest coverage is amongst the poorest households. If we look at the kind of graph I was showing before, you can see the sort of distribution, the cutoff. It's a very similar sort of example where we'd find the net winners. Particularly the biggest net winners would be the poorest, and the net funders would be those in the top 30% with the richest. So we find good reductions in inequality from this. The Gini coefficient would fall overall by about 14%, and poverty rates would reduce by about 70%. So a massive reduction. If you look across the age groups here, looking at current poverty rates in India without the universal system at the top of the blue line. And then you look at what the poverty rates would be for each age group after the system is introduced. You find a massive reduction in poverty in India if all other things are held constant in the economy and society. So we can make a major difference on inequality and poverty if we move towards building universal systems in low and middle income countries. We did similar analysis of universal systems at different levels of spending, 1%, 2%, and 3% in different countries in Asia. And you can see the more you spend, then the greater the increase in the reductions in inequality. And so what are the challenges that we face? I think the challenge that most countries are facing now that are committed to the poor relief model, just giving means tested programs to the poor, is that these schemes, if they target the poorest, they're not popular. No government wants to really invest very much in them. That's why they have very low budgets, because they're excluding most of the population and they're excluding the main taxpayers. So nobody wants to invest in those schemes. And that's why you find such low levels of investment in means tested schemes globally. Whereas if a scheme is given to everyone, then it's likely that will have strong popular support and therefore have strong political backing. And that's why we see much higher levels of transfer in universal schemes. And in fact, transfer values tend to be much higher as well than we find in poverty targeted programs. And so just coming near the end, I think the challenge that we find in that, if you look on the left here, with many countries that have the poor relief system, it kind of undermines the social contract, because by delivering poor quality, poor relief systems, you build low trust in government. It leads to a weaker social contract and higher levels of inequality, an unwillingness to pay taxes, low government revenues, and you get this vicious circle where you have general government revenues stay very, very low, and it's difficult to move to much higher levels of government spending, including universal public services. And the shift that countries need to make is to start putting in place more good quality universal public services to build greater trust in government, because that's how we build it, through simple universal services. We'll build then a stronger social contract and greater equality, a greater willingness to pay taxes, higher government revenues, and then we create a virtuous circle where we can invest more in universal systems, not just in social security, health, education, etc. And if you look at those two as a kind of the challenge for many low and middle income countries, move from the left to the right, think about Europe. The kind of on the left is pretty much pre-war Europe, the situation that we had, rise in fascism, lack of trust in government. And the situation on the right is post-war Europe, where the social democratic consensus took over as countries decided never to return to the situations pre-Second World War. And there was a massive move to then a commitment to universal systems. And underlying these two different approaches, I think, is very different ideologies that are there. This kind of charity paradigm of investing in poor relief or means-tested schemes is very much about giving handouts to the other people who are different to us. It's about low taxes and spending, very much driven by a kind of neoliberal ideology, and leads to these targeted schemes with high exclusion. And of course, it's the rich that benefit most from this, because they actually pay less taxes. That's why the rich tend to prefer poverty-targeted schemes, as compared to a citizenship paradigm, which is more to what we've moved towards in Europe, based on the right to social security of everyone, for everybody, which is based on the recognition that we have to have higher taxes and spending, which of course come from the provision of universal services. The schemes are much more inclusive and are given to everybody in society. And of course, from these, the poor benefit most from universal schemes. So I'll just finish off just here to say that I think the big choice, I think that many low and middle income countries have, and I think the EU as a development partner has to think about the type of support they're going to give, is are we going to support countries to, if we think about it as buying a type of car, what are countries going to buy a second-hand larder, sort of poor relief system with conditional cash transfers, proxy means tests, workfare, these horrible social registries that have been put in place around countries that nobody's proud of. It doesn't get you very far, breaks down all the time. Or do countries want to start to move towards a much more Rolls-Royce inclusive social security system, like we have ended up having in Europe? It took many years to develop, based around an inclusive life cycle social security system, a multi-tiered system. But if that's going to be too costly, perhaps countries can start with the Toyota system and then move over time, even longer in the longer term to the Rolls-Royce system. So I'll just finish there. Thanks very much for listening.
Wow, it was a fascinating presentation and easy to listen, powered with amazing graphs and data and a very strong argument. So thank you so much, Stephen. We won't debate the brand and the mark of the cars you've chosen. I'll let that to the debate for the Q&A. I might have my doubts with Rolls-Royce, but I'm biased. Very quickly, coming up to our second speakers. Sorry, I'm confused now. So, sorry?
OECD, Sohyun.
Yes, Sohyun Kim from OECD.
Thanks, Jerome. Let me share my screen first. Okay. I'm sorry, my slide is nowhere near to.
No worries. And just as you get ready, in the chat, our colleagues from MKS will post the link where you can go to the platform to post your questions to all of the presenters. Over to you, Sohyun.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to speak at this virtual EU seminar on addressing inequalities. I'm Sohyun Kim at the OECD Development Center. And then today I'm going to talk about some opportunities and challenges to extend social protection in the context of a high informality, and how to make social protection more relevant for inequality reduction using an OECD database on informality. Okay, can I move to the next slide? So why does addressing inequality in development cooperation matter? So there is alarming evidence of rising income and wealth inequalities around the globe, and the signs that many citizens are dissatisfied with a development model that is perceived to put the interest of the powerful elites first, while putting the issues of inequality and social justice on the back burner, risking social cohesion in many countries. Indeed, we have seen a tremendous increase in global wealth in the past decades, but the spread of income and wealth inequalities has gone far and wide. About half of the world's wealth is now owned by the richest 1% of the world population, while the bottom half owns no more than 1%. As a result, addressing inequality is becoming more important in the EU and global policy making. A key principle of the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind, a broad concept of inclusion that incorporates a commitment to reduce all forms of inequality within countries. Last but not least, we are also facing growing demand from partner countries for what I would call actionable, timely, and forward-looking evidence-based policy advice to support more inclusive policy making, and to monitor and address the social impacts of structural transformation. Clearly, this high level of inequality cannot be sustained for much longer. Tackling inequalities calls upon a holistic approach to address the multiple dimensionality of the drivers of inequality across the entire income and wealth distribution, in which domestic policies play a prominent role. So from the development cooperation side, among the range of policy instruments that directly target inequality reduction, social protection and progressive income taxes occupy a specific place. Why? Because social protection now constitutes an essential component of the global agenda for sustainable development, and it appears among the key policy priorities in several regional and national commitments. The renewed interest in social protection reflects both the recognition of social protection as a human right under international human rights law and the fact that investing in social protection is increasingly considered as a key mechanism for achieving inclusive growth. Then how much hope shall we place on the public transfers and the direct taxes to reduce income inequalities across countries at different stages of development? Piggybacking on Alva's and Dr. Stevens' detailed explanation, when we look at data in countries on the right-hand side of the graph, mostly OECD countries with consolidated welfare states, public transfers and the direct taxes reduce income inequality quite substantially. However, in developing countries on the left-hand side in the red circle, the redistributive effects of public transfers and direct taxes are very limited, mainly because gaps in social protection coverage in those countries remain very large. So one major barrier that limits social protection coverage in developing countries is the massive prevalence of informality in the labor force. According to the latest estimates, informal employment represents nearly 90% of total employment in low-income countries, 67% in middle-income countries, and 17% in high-income countries. The informality in the workforce is the greatest in Africa. In developing countries, a majority of workers operating in the informal economy have little or no access to employment-based social protection. And this lack of social protection coverage for most informal workers is one reason that 55% of the world's population is only partially or not at all covered by social protection. Without social protection coverage, the livelihoods of millions of informal workers are at risk, and it creates a formidable development policy challenge. On top of that, COVID-19 has worsened the vulnerability of informal workers. Informal workers have been disproportionately hit by the restrictive measures adopted during the pandemic crisis. For example, confinement policies in the absence of social protection have threatened the livelihoods of informal workers and the very survival of poor communities, with millions of people losing jobs without any access to income sources. While the prospects of economic recovery remain uncertain, many informal workers will likely continue to require some income support in the coming years. Having said that, during COVID, many countries supported the most vulnerable as quickly as possible through social protection measures. Broadly speaking, these measures came in three ways. So first, expanding coverage and benefits of existing programs, both social insurance and social assistance. Second, developing new temporary programs, in particular for informal workers. And then lastly, making administrative requirements simpler and more user-friendly. However, what we see at this moment is that the longer-term needs of informal economy workers continue to fall through the cracks of most social protection systems after the short-term temporary support during the pandemic is gone. Income risks have escalated during confinement and remain very high, as many important informal workers still remain excluded from social protection systems. So looking ahead, in order to enhance social protection systems in the context of large informality, we need to develop sound informality diagnosis based on new indicators that take into account not only the individual characteristics, but the household characteristics of informal workers. The information is critical to identify the risks and opportunities informal workers experience and to translate them into concrete social protection extension strategies in a much more accurate manner. Getting this information is the very purpose of the new OECD key indicators of informality based on individuals and their households, aka KeyB dataset. To extend social protection to informal workers, first of all, we need to determine the appropriate mix of contributory and non-contributory schemes in social protection extension strategies. The KeyB database offers a typology of informal workers by income class that could be used as one criterion for deciding which types of schemes to extend to which workers. The graph shows that the majority of informal workers are poor, but there is a wide variation in their income distribution. So to reduce the social protection gap by informal workers' income class, we can think of, for example, operating non-contributory tax-financed universal programs for the poor and subsidized contributory schemes for the near poor, and contributory schemes without subsidies for middle and high-income informal workers. The second option to extend social protection to informal workers is to extend contributory social insurance schemes, probably jointly funded by both employers and employees. But to make this work, we need to answer two questions. The first question is if it's possible to identify the informal employment relationship between an employer and an employee to link to the extended contributory schemes. Our answer is potentially yes. The KIBI data shows that most informal workers are employees and own account workers. In other words, for a significant share of informal workers, the extension of contributory social insurance can be linked to an identifiable employment relationship. Another question is whether there are enough informal workers who can contribute to social insurance schemes. Looking at the individual contributory capacity of informal workers is critical because recent experiences with the development of social insurance schemes for informal workers tell us that affordability issues indeed matter. Our answer is it depends. As the graph shows, the large number of informal workers are low-paid workers, but at the same time, a non-negligible proportion of informal workers are medium or high earners. For low-earning informal workers, the contributory capacity will be limited, and therefore the social insurance may need to be subsidized and or complemented with employers' contributions when possible. But higher earning informal workers may have some capacity, contribute to social insurance with or without their employers. But we need more research on this area. So the last option to extend social protection to informal workers is extending child benefits and social pensions. From our data, we found that just over half of children and older dependents live in households where all workers are informal. This points to the potential role of child benefits and social pensions in reducing the vulnerability of informal workers and their household members. To recap, the key messages I want you to take away from my talk today include high level of economic inequality cannot be sustained for much longer, and tackling inequalities calls upon a holistic approach to address the multidimensionality of the drivers of inequality throughout the entire income and wealth distribution, not just for the bottom 40%. And extending social protection could play a prominent role to reduce income inequality in developing countries. However, informality is a major barrier on the road towards universal social protection. New informality diagnoses that take into account the household context of informal workers can help identify options to extend social protection to informal economy workers. Let me stop here. Thanks for listening.
So many thanks, Soyun. A very interesting presentation as well. Again, setting the scene with a different perspective with informal workers, actually nicely linking with what we had this morning on employment creation and decent work, but showing how taking different perspective helps us rethink the type of policy and policy instruments that may be used to reduce inequalities and how that can make a dent also to poverty. Before we move to the next two guest speakers, I cannot help just to make a link of these two presentations with the reference document and the principles that they promote. We've seen on the first day, two elements that have been portrayed here by Stephen and by you, Soyun. Two key elements, a lot of focus on data, research, analysis to really understand the perspective, what's going on, who is affected by which type of policies and instruments, what works. That is a very important call you're making to all of us on working and financing more of that. And the second one, that those issues are contentious, and then we need to inform decision-making, we need to inform the taxpayers and the voters to make sure that the political shift does occur to change a system and that there is a demand for change of the system. Let me not go on with that. That was just an intermediary point. Let me call to the floor our colleague, Dr. Okada from ESCAP. I'll let you present yourself.
Hello, Jérôme. Coco is fine. Thank you very much. If I will share my screen. So thank you, everybody, for this opportunity to share with you some of our results of our social protection simulator tool, which we have developed together with Development Pathways. So big thanks to Stephen Kidd and your excellent team at Development Pathways. Before at the beginning of this presentation, I'd like to just go over an overview of social protection in Asian Pacific and to highlight the need for such a simulator tool. Firstly, we see that we have very low levels of expenditure in the region. This has also been highlighted in previous presentations, with a large number of countries in Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific spending less than 2% of their GDP on social protection. And this brings down the regional average expenditure on social protection to just 4.9% of GDP, far lower than the global average of 2.9% of GDP. And we'd like to also point out that countries are not necessarily, more higher spending countries aren't necessarily the richer countries in the region. We also have lower income countries such as Mongolia being the highest spenders on social protection in the region, and Mongolia also having very high levels of coverage as well. So a link to the very low levels of expenditure, we also have very low levels of coverage of social protection across North Central Asia, Pacific, Southeast Asia, and Southwest Asia. And we have a majority, over half the population in Asian Pacific do not have access to any form of social protection schemes. And many of the schemes that are made available tend to be non-contributory and poverty-targeted schemes. And we have very low level of contributory schemes in the region, with just 38% on average, 38% of the workforce in Asia Pacific contributing into a social protection scheme. And linked to this are the very, very high levels of informality in the region. We see here that up to over 90% of the workforce in Bangladesh is in informal employment, and we have very high levels across the other countries as well. And so, as Stephen Kidd and the previous speakers also alluded to, this leads to the issue of the missing middle, where we have a high number of workers that are not eligible to contribute into scheme, either because they are not legally, their occupations are not legally recognized, domestic workers or home-based workers, or their employer is not legally registered as a business, or they may have lower or less predictable sources of income, or such as seasonal workers may not qualify for contributory durations required to contribute into programs. So many barriers facing informal workers in accessing contributory schemes, but also they may not be poor enough to qualify for poverty-targeted non-contributory schemes, leaving the majority of the workforce and their families unprotected. And so these high levels of informality are constraining the expansion of contributory benefits, and hence highlighting the role and importance of non-contributory social protection schemes to fill this gap. So recognizing this, ESCAP together with Development Pathways, we have created a social protection simulation model that draws on household income and expenditure surveys to look at the impact that different types of social protection schemes can have on tangible and measurable outcome indicators, economic indicators such as poverty, inequality, and consumption, as well as looking at the expansion of coverage and the cost implications of these schemes. The tool currently covers 23 countries and is really built as a way to empower policymakers with user-friendly access to data to help guide their policymaking on and decisions on social and options on social protection. The tool currently looks at 3 branches of non-contributory schemes in terms of child benefits, disability, and old age. And we are currently also adding maternity benefits to the scheme. So when you access the tool, it will bring you to a dashboard looking at, for example, if we select a country, in this case, the country example of Indonesia, we see that the benefits, the impact of providing a universal non-contributory benefit to all households with children aged 0 to 18, to all households with a person with severe disability, and to all households with a person aged 65 and older. Providing these 3 universal benefits at the global average benefit levels, where we have here, this would be the equivalent of 4% of GDP per capita for child benefits, 14% of GDP per capita for disability benefits, and 16% of GDP per capita for old age benefits. And providing this, the combination of these 3 schemes, which also cover major life cycle contingencies of child disability and old age, as Stephen Kidd also highlighted in his presentation, this would achieve a poverty reduction impact in Indonesia of up to 81% of the total population, and reduce inequality by 11% as measured by the Gini coefficient. It would also increase consumption by 58% amongst the poorest 10% of the total population, and cover the majority of the population would then have access to at least one social protection scheme by providing this universal, these 3 universal schemes at the cost of just 2.8% of GDP. When we click on the poverty tile, we also see some more disaggregated information in terms by different, the national and the 3 international poverty lines. And we see here that child benefits would have the has the highest poverty reduction impact, and this is a finding that it is common for many countries such as Indonesia with a very youthful demographic, so that even despite having the most modest benefit level of just 4% of GDP per capita, simply because of the demographics of the country, it would have a very, very high poverty reduction impact, and this we see for other countries as well. If we look also at inequality, would reduce by up to 11% for the Gini coefficient, and we see here other metrics such as the Palmer ratio and the quintile ratio, and again we see that child benefits would have the greatest impact in reducing inequality. If we look now at looking at the impact of just one universal scheme, here we have selected the impact of providing an old age benefit in Georgia at the global benefit level of 16% of GDP per capita. We see that this would decrease poverty by almost a half for the total population, reduce inequality by 14%, and have increased consumption by 45% amongst the poorest 10% of the population, and cover over half the population at a cost of just 2.7% of GDP. When we look at providing different sorts of benefit levels and the impact that this would have on inequality, again looking at the same old age benefit, universal benefits at the in Georgia, we see on the left hand side the different inequality levels with no schemes in place. And on the right-hand side, on the far right-hand side, we see the benefit levels when providing the existing benefit level that provides a universal old age benefit at 150 Georgian lari per month. And we see that this already has a very substantial inequality reduction impact. And if we raise this level to the global average benefit level of 16% GDP per capita, or 247 Georgian lari per month, this would have an even greater impact on reducing inequality. So the quintile ratio, for example, with no schemes in place, the top 20% of the top 20% of earners in Georgia would be are earning 8 times the income of the poorest 20% of the population. But this falls to just 6 times more of the top 20% of earners earning just under 6 times more than the lowest 20% earners. So there is quite a significant reduction in the gaps between the richest and the poorest earners in the country. When we look also at the impact of consumption by welfare deciles of recipients, again looking at the same provision of the universal old age pension at the global average benefit level, we can also see the impact that this would have in narrowing the gaps between the richest and the poorest populations. And we see a significant increase in consumption expenditure capacity for the poorest welfare decile, boosting the consumption by up to 90% for the poorest welfare decile. And we also see an impact, a higher consumption impact for the highest welfare decile, but by far we see a very, very high consumption impact because of this added cash transfer into households at the poorest welfare deciles for even the recipient populations. And we also see in terms of coverage, the distribution of benefits across different types of households. And we see that the benefit would also reach households that we generally consider to be more at risk of being in vulnerable situations, such as those with skip generation or one-person households with persons aged 60 and above. And these households would boost their consumption quite significantly through this universal old age benefit, and thereby have that added cash transfer cushion to help mitigate their vulnerabilities and also inequalities. The tool also allows users to target, to look at the impact of providing targeted schemes. And here we have, by customizing, we have the tool allows users to customize and make it more tailored, customized social protection scheme by looking at the different parameters and setting different parameters in terms of benefit levels, age eligibility, and the administrative costs of a scheme, and also applying a proxy means test to the scheme. And here we have again chosen the old age benefit in Georgia, provided at the global benefit level of 16% GDP per capita, but then targeted to the poorest 40% of the population. And we see that this has naturally a much lower impact on poverty reduction, inequality reduction, consumption increase, and covers a much lower portion of the population. And although it costs a lot less, the impact of such a scheme would be far, far less. In addition, when we look at the same poverty targeted scheme, in terms of coverage, we also see, as Stephen Kidd also highlighted earlier in his presentation, the very the exclusion errors that would result by applying a proxy means test as a means of identifying the eligible people, households to receive the poverty targeted benefits. So here, the benefit should be reaching the bottom 40% of the population, the welfare deciles 1 to 4. But in fact, we see very, very high levels of exclusion, up to 60% of households in the poorest welfare decile and up to 70% of households in the fourth welfare decile would not be receiving a benefit. And in contrast, we would see that households in the upper 5 to 10 welfare deciles would be receiving a benefit when they were in fact not targeted. So very high levels of leakage, often due to poor quality and outdated data. And in contrast to this, universal schemes, particularly child and old age benefits, would have much simpler means of verification based on age and residency. So by this means, we'd be able to bypass this very complex and expensive targeting mechanism which is also quite, as we can see, ineffective in reaching the beneficiaries that are intended. So some key takeaways are that benefits do reduce poverty and in particular boost consumption, particularly for the poorest welfare deciles, and help to decrease the gaps between the rich and the poor. And the benefit levels do matter and should be raised to be at a level that are adequate for households to be able to live, meet an adequate standard of living, and that they can be within reach for countries and you know, within in terms of affordability. Although affordability, as Alba also mentioned in her presentation, is more a matter of government will and the amounts that governments are willing to invest and see social protection as an investment and the benefits gained through social protection. Social protection also provides, and I think here, it's also important to highlight that yes, social protection does reduce poverty, and yes, it does reduce inequality, but the main rationale for social protection isn't primarily as a poverty reduction tool. Social protection is primarily, first off, is a human rights. But also its primary focus is really to provide a basic income guarantee to ensure that households, regardless of the disruptions they may find in terms of their incomes or livelihoods or life contingencies, such as having a child or falling sick or losing a job, that they have access to basic income security to ensure and retain an adequate standard of living. And I think sometimes when we see the poverty reduction impact, and there's a tendency to see, especially in this Asia Pacific region, to see social protection as more a poverty reduction tool, but in fact, it is something that should be made available to all individuals, regardless of income status or employment status. And also highlights the impact that social protection has in reducing other forms of inequality by ensuring that households can avoid negative coping mechanisms, such as having to take your child out of school or having to sell your livestock or assets, and enable them to invest their resources and time into more productive activities, such as being able to take risks to expand your livelihoods or investing in reskilling or skills development. And also, of course, having multiplier effects in terms of smoothing consumption, particularly during crises such as COVID-19, COVID crises such as COVID-19. So I think, and finally, yes, providing cash transfers to households can help to redistribute resources amongst households and narrow gaps between the richest and poorest populations. But if we want to look at the redistributive impact, particularly of non-contributory benefits, it is important, as has been highlighted in Alba's presentation, to look at the sources of financing for non-contributory benefits, particularly, for example, through taxation, and how redistributive these financing sources are, to look at the wider picture of the impact of social protection in terms of redistribution and redistributing between across society, from healthy working-aged populations to those in need and at lower levels of income. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Coco. I think it was fascinating, and again, a great tool for demonstrating, making the case, evidencing what happens with different instruments. So let's not take time just on that now, because we are running with time. We want to keep the Q&A. So please do come in, Guillermo.
Thank you, Johan. I'll share my screen as well. A few slides to illustrate my point. And
all perspectives.
Yeah, and the idea here, and I was invited, and I appreciate the invitation, is to bring these ideas down to the ground and see how we are implementing them in Paraguay. So I think we agree, and I suspect there's a little bit of selection bias in the choice of panelists. That we agree that universal, no, but we agree here, at least in this panel, that universal protection is a desirable outcome, and it is key to reducing inequalities. Yes, that sounds great. I think we all agree on the endpoints, but the how the path that we take and the how we get there is another question, and I think a very relevant one. And I want to guide you on how we think about that path in the particular case of Paraguay. And in order to illustrate that thought, I disaggregate in two questions. One is, what constraints do we face when seeking and working towards these goals on the ground? And is there anything already there from which we need to build upon? Because it's easier to envision these goals and say, okay, we start from scratch, there's nothing on the ground, let's build this in universal social protection, reducing inequalities, excellent. But generally we have to build where there is something there already. So how do we work with that? Just a little bit of context. Paraguay has a population of a little under 7 million people. It's a high middle income country as measured by GDP. That is maybe you could say on average, but it's a highly unequal country. So to a large extent, Paraguay shares many of the social and economic challenges of middle income countries still. Poverty rate is around 20%, with extreme poverty at 6%. This is the nationally defined poverty line, and a Gini index of 43. It has been declining from 51 in 2010. Informality is still high at 64%, and social protection coverage is low, as measured by the indicator of SDG 1.3. Only 31.4% of the population have access to at least one social protection benefits. Only 61% of the population receives old age benefits. 8.2% of eligible persons receive maternity benefits, and no one receives an unemployment benefit because there is no unemployment insurance or unemployment scheme in Paraguay. So that's just brief context. And these challenges exist in a context. There is institutional capacity. It's new. There's a Ministry of Social Development created in 2018. It existed as agencies or special divisions within other ministries, and their Ministry of Labor, Employment, and Social Security since 2013. There are programs already in place, non-contributory targeted transfer programs like the Copora or the old age pension scheme from at least 2006 when they started, and the Social Security Agency, which articulates the contributory components of social protection, exists since 1943. So that's kind of just the situation. So when we seek to expand, strengthen social protection in Paraguay and reducing inequalities, what constraints do we face? I say one is financial. Paraguay has a very low tax base, and this points to both Alba and Coco's points about the financing mechanisms. Paraguay has a very low tax base, which means eventually a very limited fiscal space to expand expenditure. So that is one constraint. There's another one, which is institutional. The ministries I mentioned, they're relatively new, and they're relatively small. So in a way, the capacity of the government to develop plans, to implement programs, and to reach the different parts of the country, particularly more isolated parts, is relatively limited. And there's also the possibility, which may be a constraint in certain cases, that there are existing institutions. In particular, I refer to the tradition of the contributory social protection institution, which is in the collective imagination, in the collective feeling, it is very important. IPS is a very relevant institution, and when you speak about social protection or social security, the conversation goes inevitably to the contributory component. So still the idea that there is a legitimacy or a need for non-contributory social protection is relatively weak, in part because there is a very strong institution in dealing with the contributory component. Another constraint is political. Politics in Paraguay, unlike other countries, are less ideological. They're very pragmatic politics, and there's very low political priority to inequality reduction. And in particularly this points to what Stephen was mentioning, that when we deal with social protection, are we dealing with a paradigm of citizenship or a paradigm of charity? And I think in Paraguay still we have some work to do in establishing this or moving the political priority towards inequality reduction. So that means that still social protection programs are still thought as merely poverty alleviation mechanisms. And this is in part also related to the existing institutions. There's still the idea that eventually we might get there, that through formal work we will provide social protection to everyone, but I think that we're starting to believe that that won't be the case. And there are other more structural constraints. The labor markets are relatively weak. I mentioned high informality, and the low productivity sector is quite large in Paraguay, which means that the contributory capacity of many workers, and this echoes what Yoon was mentioning, is relatively weak. So we can expect in the medium, short, or even long term that everyone will be able to contribute through social security contributions to financing a social protection system for everyone. And this is all related, of course. And creates in a way the vicious cycle that Stephen mentioned. So how do we work in such a context and advance social protection for inequality reduction? I think one key aspect is that there are multiple actors on the ground with multiple messages and different priorities, and that multiplicity doesn't work because, say, the ILO, we work mainly with ministries of labor. If we send one message to them and then the IMF sends another message to central banks and the World Bank another message to ministries of finance, the cacophony will not lead to kind of a political streamlining of the priorities we want to articulate. So in that regard, I think the European delegation has played a key role in articulating these different actors in this. And just to mention a few, there's the ILO, UNICEF, UNDP, FAO, the IMF, World Bank, the IADB, and the delegation. And then we can add other donors like GIZ, AIZ. So having one actor that kind of guides the process and helps each agency have a specific role in a broader strategy, I think has been a key role of the EU delegation in Paraguay. And this, in a way, what the messaging and the strategy, we can summarize it as the fact that unprotected risks drive poverty and inequality. If in Paraguay you fall sick, you are in risk of poverty, you are at risk of seriously undermining your income and any capital you may have. And in the idea is to tackle the different constraints with incremental but also complementary work. So yes, poverty reduction, we can ignore that tremendous need, but also the need to promote autonomous earnings through decent work opportunities, employment plans, and also extend contributory social security coverage and the sustainability of that system, so that one part of the social protection system grows in the direction from high earners to middle income earners, and another component starts growing from the specific poverty alleviation over towards middle income as well. And there's a strong case for strengthening institutions so that capacity is built on the ground and stays. and eventually develop a tax reform and enhance fiscal space to finance social protection expansion. Another key aspect above just having this common narrative and complementary strategies is to build trust and capacity. These, as agencies, we don't have the capacity to do this on our own, so we need the government and we need to work with them. And building trust, making friends with them is a key issue in being able to get the work done with both policymakers at the higher level, but also technical staff, which tend to give some more continuity to programs, and through the generation of evidence, allowing them to participate in courses in certain, so that they become part of this narrative as well. It's also important to identify key players, and in the case of Paraguay, the Ministry of Finance is a key, very important player. Nothing gets done without the approval of the Ministry of Finance, which is the ministry that has the greatest budget of all, unlike in other countries where ministries of finance manage a small budget in themselves. In Paraguay, the Ministry of Finance implements, develops, and designs programs, and the budget office allows to articulate with the program developers in other line ministries. So that is a key center, and it may not be the case in other countries, but it is so in Paraguay. And social partners, civil society, trade unions, and employer organizations also are key players, because they offer continuity to certain programs and certain narratives. Governments change, staff change, but the civil society, trade unions, and employer organizations allow to give and have a longer term perspective in the discussions. We also found that it's important to create a common language for different ministries and stakeholders to collaborate with each other. Generally, it happens to us as well. As in big organizations, we silo in each other and eventually create a specific language and tools, and don't necessarily talk to each other. And in that sense, having a results-based budgeting in Paraguay has mandated, in a sense, the fact that line ministries and the Ministry of Finance and the Budget Office have to have a common system to talk to each other. And the social protection system that the Paraguay is implementing, the VAMOS, also allows to integrate the different initiatives. So this is another contextual factor that is important in Paraguay. Social protection is dispersed in many, many different agencies and ministries. The old age pension is managed by the Ministry of Finance. The conditional cash transfers for families is managed by the Ministry of Social Development. And so Ministry of Childhood has some programs for children, transfers for children. So the social protection system is a way to articulate all these different initiatives and social protection programs. And another issue is timing. In Paraguay, the window of opportunity to get things done is generally very small. Things happen, and it is important to talk about, say, unemployment insurance. The window opens, you need to have everything ready right then, so that you have it. People start asking about unemployment insurance. Oh, it just happens. I have a plan right here for you. Great, let's go. Let's work with this. Let's go to Congress. So I think there's a lot of work that is done in the background that is not very, say, mediatic, but allows us to have everything ready for when that window opens. And key moments are also cyclical. Not necessarily in the case of Paraguay is the election season, but the transition between governments after the election. Unlike other countries, when candidates have a specific program of kind of their promise of what they want to achieve when they get into office and when they get elected. In Paraguay, that generally doesn't happen during the election season. It happens once they get elected. So the transition period is key, and they are generally very open with agencies in discussing what their priorities should be. So, and election season is now in Paraguay, so April 30 opens this transition period and this opportunity to consolidate the narrative and go forth and convince them that social protection and inequality reduction is a key issue in the country. Those are just a few ideas I have. I hope this has been useful, and happy to discuss further. And I also say hi to colleagues that I recognize from the ground in Asunción. So it's nice to see you.
Thank you so much, Guillermo. And actually, you've done the job of facilitation, because you've just been recapitulating a number of ideas of the previous presentations and putting them together in the framework of our development cooperation and the instruments we have at use, the EU weights, the fundamental values, the dialogue, the capacity development, the trust, how we use that for data, putting into context how we can use our resources to create incentives and keep on building over time, using the windows of opportunities. So all of those elements are part of what you do at INPA and what is being proposed by INPA to their also the partners. So thank you so much for that. And I think because of this, it allows me to go transition directly to the questions and make most of the time that we have for those questions. So these questions have been posted on the platform. Let me move there. Sorry, I'm still actually some reason displaying the previous presentation. So let me just switch screen. That's it. And we will show you the questions posted. Oh, this is really a bad situation for me today. Here we are. Sorry. So let me.
Some are resources from Stephen Cade, and
okay, okay. Thanks, Stephen, for posting some more resources to us, so we can access them. Perhaps we go from bottom up.
Okay, let's do that.
So that the first speakers can be answering some of the questions. So you can see for Stephen, do we see this impact in both conditional and unconditional mean testing programs? So I guess I should need to read all of the questions together, considering all aspects of social protection, strong role in reducing inequalities, particularly the redistributive role. It's surprising that inequality rates low as a topic of the 43 countries with SP programs. Can you? Oh, okay.
Okay, Jerome. I think
this is more to you. So sorry, I'm mixing questions.
Yeah. So should I take that if we're really going from the bottom up?
Okay, and then we'll let perhaps our colleagues read the questions for coming to them.
Exactly, perfect. So hi everyone, I'm Ermina Soko. I work with Alba, who had to leave for another meeting on social protection, and it's very nice to see all these familiar faces and to get all these questions as well. On this question, I think the colleague who asked it was referring to the slide that Alba showed where we have mapped the topics, the social protection topics that we are addressing in these MIPs, or in this, let's say, financing framework for these 7 years. And just to clarify that inequality there was only 1 or 2 programs, I think, because this is where explicitly the links between inequality and social protection are mentioned in the MIP. So this is not, it doesn't mean that in the other programs, social protection does not obviously have its normal redistributive role. It's just that only one delegation identified that actually and mentioned it in the MIP. So, and also that was also at the MIP level, not at the action document, where obviously we're getting at more concrete outcomes. So that it does not mean that in the other 43 countries, we don't focus on the redistributive aspect. So we try to steer away from programs that, for example, support social pensions for government employees, right? This is not something we would do. So in all of our programs, we very much have an inequality reducing mindset and focus. Not always perfectly, but we are trying.
Thank you. Amoni. For the benefits of our guest speakers, the MIP is
Oh, multi-annual indicative
program. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Learning.
Stephen, do we see this impact in both conditional and unconditional mean testing programs? So I guess here we're referring to the means testing program that you presented.
I think it's referring to because I saw this question come up at the time when you were presenting the targeting errors, right? And so are these targeting errors both similar or, in both conditional and unconditional mean testing programs?
Yeah, I think the errors that we showed were both conditional and conditional programs, as well as some workfare programs, which is sort of a form of conditionality. So they often use the similar targeting methodologies. So the proxy means test that's been promoted a lot globally is a very inaccurate method, but it's used in both conditional and conditional transfers. So it has the same levels of inaccuracy often embedded in these social registries that are being promoted, and they have these very high levels of inaccuracy as well. So I think the inaccuracy aspect is similar across all targeted means tested programs.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Shall we keep going through the questions?
Sure. The next one is for Alba, so for me now. But I would invite also other like-minded panelists to please come in with this question, because it is a difficult one. And does universality mean equity?
Okay.
I mean, this is it's a difficult one, and I think it's difficult to say if universality will lead to equity, right? I think it's probably knowing what we know. It's the safest option, right? Knowing what we see, the evidence we see from other programs, from various programs on the ground, it seems to be the safest way to get to equity. But of course, a lot depends on also, as we saw in previous sessions, especially the fiscal session, actually, is a lot depends on how money is raised, right? How the revenue is raised to pay for these universal schemes. If everything is raised through, I don't know, taxes that are not progressive, then probably not, right? So if the revenues that pay for these programs are raised from, I don't know, indirect taxes, etc., then maybe not. So it's not an easy question to answer. But I'd also like to invite if any other panelists would like to come in on this difficult question.
So does universality means equity, and how does that link up to domestic resource mobilization? Who would like to start getting sharing views? I think that's very important for colleagues working in delegations and using their budget support tools.
I can come in. So the last point is, how does this link up to domestic resource mobilization?
I guess the first question was, does universality mean equity or means equity? Or can we equate both? If you go for universal schemes, do you go for equity? And
and I think you're linking it to the other question we saw further up, which is how are universal schemes linked to domestic revenue mobilization, right?
Yeah, no, I think the issue would be, depending on how we define equity, clearly more universal schemes are much more equitable because you're giving everybody in society exactly the same, right? So when you're doing on the sort of flat rate transfer of the basic tax finance, so it's a more equitable way. So the rich get the same transfer as the poorest members of society. So it's very equitable, and also around many of these tax finance schemes, particularly the sort of social pensions, child benefits, they actually are very much mainly given to females. So they can promote gender equity much more. They're a core means of women's empowerment in many ways. So women tend to get more than men. Men tend to benefit a bit more, rather more from the social insurance schemes. In the domestic resource mobilization. I think the kind of key point I was trying to make around at the end of my talk, I think is the critical point is that, you know, it's around this virtuous and vicious circle. The poverty targeted schemes tend to have very small budgets because, as I said, they're very unpopular with the majority of taxpayers, and therefore governments don't want to get behind them. So if you look across Africa, most of the donor promoted poverty targeted schemes, governments don't want to put their money into them, right? Because you're not going to win an election. Nobody's going to vote. You're just going to alienate the taxpayers because they're not benefiting. So governments don't want to invest in them. So they tend to be continually supported by donors, right? Which is why the EU is kind of stuck in Malawi funding a large social cash transfer, because the government of Malawi would much prefer a universal pension, but none of the donors want to support the government of Malawi in doing that. They're continuing on with their poverty target scheme, which the government of Malawi doesn't want to put its money into, right? Fertilizer subsidy is a lot better because they're much more much higher coverage, especially amongst voters. Whereas the universal schemes, you know, because they build trust, they're also very big election winners, right? Because if you put in place a universal scheme, many countries have done that. Kenya in 2018 used a universal pension to help win the election. Many other countries have done it. That's how Social Democrats won elections in Europe after 1945, is by putting in place universal schemes. And so you win the elections, they're popular. Taxpayers, therefore, are much more willing to pay tax to get these benefits, and therefore your general government revenues will increase over time. I could show a lot of other work on that. There's a paper I shared on trust and social security, which kind of explains that a bit more. And therefore your domestic resource mobilization will go up because you're increasing the willingness of people generally to be taxed, right? Because they're getting high quality public services. That's why in Sweden, the most respected institution in Sweden is the tax office. And why do Swedes love paying tax? Because they get fantastic universal public services, right? Whereas in the UK, we're getting our services a bit worse. So we're much more reluctant to pay our taxes in the UK because, you know, we've got pretty bad governments that are just destroying our universal public services. So it's kind of very sort of simple methods. And I think there are middle income countries where you can see the provision of universal social security schemes has, we can't say attribution, led to, has gone along with increases in government revenues, significant increases in some cases in government revenues, although we can't, because nobody's really done this study, we can't say there's attribution about that, but it's an amazing coincidence. And this is what happened in Europe after 1945 as well.
Thanks so much for that, shedding so much light. Guillermo, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. I just to complement what has been said about this topic, I just can't help thinking that this eventually leads us to a political discussion, which is how much inequality are we willing to endure as a society, and how do we move that threshold in a way that is a political process, but also what is the role of the government in getting us there. So if we think I'm playing devil's advocate here, but we say, okay, the role is to have a basic level of welfare for everyone. How do we get there? One avenue is the government can provide, the state can provide through different schemes, but another one is the labor market gets you there. And if the labor market doesn't get you there, then the government comes in, a subsidiary state, which is what we call it here down here. And kind of the model for Latin American states is that one. It plays a secondary role. So we might agree equity, we might agree where we want to get there, but if we don't agree on what comes first, then we're always going to be handicapped in a way in achieving this, because if we leave it for the labor market to solve this as a first case, then we're never going to get there, or it's going to be too expensive, or we're going to have exclusion rates, etc. So it involves, you know, a radical changing paradigm in a way of how we think about how we solve these equity issues and how much we are willing to endure in terms of inequality. That's the kind of the reflection I have, and also from the technical side, we might agree on which programs we want to implement, but politically, I think we need to step back a bit and prepare the ground for that to happen. And it's not easy.
Thank you. Let me share the screen back to where we were, because we have more questions to go with you. So those, sorry, yes, there was one question, and you'll take them in the order you want. What role social protection can have for the just transition? We have the case of Indonesia presented, and we know that in Indonesia there was huge subsidies to fossil fuel, limiting fiscal space for governments to do something else with it. How are universal schemes linked to domestic revenue normalizations? We've just mentioned that. Something more for the Commission with how social protection is integrated into the global gateway. Question also for Soyun, covering informal workers with very low contributing capacity. What is the main recommendation in countries where they are really the majority? So these are 3 questions on the table. I don't know who wants to take which one first. Maybe we can allow Soyun to respond, and then again I'll open the floor to all of you, Coco, Stephen, and Guillermo.
Sure, that'll work. Sorry, I couldn't really log into the house space, so I'm now just reading the question. So
okay, do you want me to read it back for you? What is the main?
Yes, please. Could you?
So, covering informal workers with very low contributing capacity, to be a key issue. So what is the main recommendation in countries where they are the majority, like in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asian countries? How do you deal with very high informality when you want to offer social protection?
Yeah, so based on my talk, I can suggest like there should be some tiered levels, social protection systems, which can cover, let me start from here. Like informal workers are a very heterogeneous groups. So they are very different by their activities, and then their source of income, and then how much they earn from their job. So, and then the number of jobs, and then the relationship between employers and employees are so different. So we can't really find like a silver bullet for supporting the one categorized informal workers, and even in Southeast Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's why we were suggesting some system that may incorporating some levels of different types of social protection systems, which is include subsidies for the very poor informal workers, up to the non-subsidized but the contributory systems for those who are better off, even though they are informal workers. So it could be one idea. And then maybe if I'm allowed, I can like add some ideas about the just transition and then social protection. So just transition is it includes by nature the inclusive growth. There's a social inclusion component of the green growth. So the enhancing social protection will definitely help those who are working in the losing sectors, for example, the carbon intensive or chemical intensive in energy or agricultural sectors, of course. Deciding like which type of a specific policy measures should be up to the country context, and then the industry composition. But then the social protection is all should be very pivotal element of the inclusive green growth and just transition as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much for this. Soyun, Coco.
Hi, yes, I just wanted to add in terms of the reaching informal workers, what we see a lot in the region are extension of programs to informal workers, but often these are through voluntary programs. For example, Cambodia will be launching its a pilot project and extending social health insurance to tuk-tuk drivers. But this again is through a voluntary program, and we've seen in Vietnam and in other countries that they tend to have very low, very low incentive, but also very low membership. And so they aren't really effective ways of incorporating informal workers. But also the importance, I think, of involving informal workers, because there are such a heterogeneous group, as our speaker from OECD mentioned, really bringing their voice to the table to identify why, for example, what are the incentives that they would highlight from their perspective in joining schemes. I mean, we have a lot of studies highlighting, looking at the role of providing social protection for informal workers and whether that incentivizes informality or formalization. But I think, and I think there's still a lack of concrete evidence either way. But I think we do need to bring the voices of the different groups of workers to discuss this around the table with governments. And I think that's something that we would like to encourage moving forward.
Thank you. Guillermo and Stephen?
Yeah, those 2 points on informality, there is some debate now on whether social security contributions as a key component of social protection systems are efficient or create informality, and whether it would be more efficient to just do away with social security contributions and just have a non-contributory social security system, so that we kind of avoid the inefficiencies that create this overburdening or high labor taxes. We strongly disagree with that view. Contributory social protection is a key way to finance social protection and enhance benefits for those who have the capacity to contribute, but also because it reduces social protection to just the income transfer. And it's much more than that. It's the social contract that we have as a society to protect each other, and how we and the role work plays and the role employers play, the role workers have in having this solidarity across different levels. So it's tempting to just simplify the issue and say, oh, let's do away with this, let's just have non-contributory schemes, but we'll do away with a deeper social contract base and fundamentals that we shouldn't ignore. In terms of just transition, I would just like to add to what Soyun was mentioning, that we can also consider kind of natural disasters, slow onset or fast onset disasters or whatever, as a social risk that we need to consider and protect against, because they do undermine our capacity to earn or have incomes and have income security. So building these universal systems allows to have much more reactive and responsive social protection schemes for when these disasters happen, or add specific insurance schemes for specific risks in the agriculture sector, flooding, fishing, etc. So I think just transition not only in moving away to moving towards greener economies, but also in acknowledging that the environment does create specific risks that limit our income security.
Thanks, Guillermo. Stephen, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, on these questions, a couple of points. Actually, I hate the term non-contributory, right? Because we all contribute, right? We're paying taxes. And as the basis of paying our taxes, even the informal economy workers are paying sales taxes, they're paying all kinds of other taxes, they're contributing, and therefore getting a tax financed benefit back is based on your contributions as a citizen of society, as part of the social contract. So we should kill off this term non-contributory, right? Because and recognize that we all contribute in some way, and that's where we get. we get it back. We get the benefits back, right? It's not a gift from government. That's why grants are another horrible word. It's not a gift from government. We pay the taxes to government, and they just get redistributed and give it back to us based on our contributions. Secondly, I think in terms of informal, including the informal economy, I think I think there's too much effort almost put in how do we get people to contribute into the social insurance schemes, right? When we actually know how you reach the people in the informal economy for a whole range of benefits. How did Denmark reach its informal economy to ensure that everybody has an old age pension in around 1888? They did a flat rate pension, right? How does the Netherlands do it nowadays? Well, it's a kind of pretty much a tax finance pension. That's how they reach everybody, formal and informal. And we look outside the EU, New Zealand has by far the best pension system in the world, flat rate, universal benefit. We reach informal economy workers. And that way, you can do the same through disability. It was already mentioned by Yoon, child benefits. They're a great way of reaching informal economy workers. A bit more complex, we need to look at unemployment, etc., which are a bit more difficult to do. But even within the contributory schemes, the social insurance schemes, we can use innovative methods. We did a study in Vietnam, and I think Vietnam said they were going to do it, where we actually put in place multi-tiered child benefits, whereas you would receive a child benefit if you contributed into the social insurance scheme to compensate you as an informal economy worker for the very high level of contribution you were making until those children reached a certain age, and then you would continue to contribute. The Vietnamese were trying to trial that out, and that's something, the one reason why people don't want to contribute into the social insurance schemes is it's really expensive. And because you're struggling in the informal economy, why are you going to set aside money for your old age pension? May as well get that from the tax finance pension, because you're not going to be able to invest in your kids, right? So we have to find a way of compensating people to go into these social insurance schemes. And what we showed in Vietnam, with small increases in the contribution rate, you could actually provide everybody with a child benefit that would compensate them fully for the actual contributions that they were paying. And then when the kids went away, then they would hopefully contribute because it'd be closer to the pension age, right? In terms of doing that. And you could add in other short-term benefits like unemployment benefits into that. So I don't think we have to worry about that. And I could talk about fuel subsidies, but I probably don't have time and I probably talk too much. But there is an interesting, if you want to hear, story between what Syria did on its fuel subsidy reform and collapsed into civil war as a result of that, alongside a means-tested cash benefit that was put in place to compensate people, which was the trigger, one of the big triggers for the civil war. So let's remember, social security schemes, badly designed, can absolutely undermine the social contract. And Iran, that actually at the same time reformed its fuel subsidy by putting in place essentially a universal basic income that every household got a cash transfer and because it went to everybody, nobody came out in the streets. They didn't collapse into civil war. Not defending the Iranian government now or at any time, but it was a much more sensible thing against the advice of international donors.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Again, making the point that social protection and how we think about it is at the core of a lot of what we do, whether it's just a transition, energy transition, or creating internal markets and consumption to sustain macroeconomics.
Last question.
We are on time, so I don't know if we have more time for more questions.
Just one.
Just one, if you all agree. So school meals are increasingly presented as a social protection priority. However, given the reliance on the education system, which may already be highly unequal in terms of access and quality, it may be that inequalities are further reinforced by scaling up schools meals in the absence of more fundamental provision of child benefits. Thoughts? First comers. 1 minute.
Yeah, okay. Why is it one against the other? Free school meals. Absolutely every child should have a free school meal. It's absolutely essential. Government should be putting that in place. It helps you get through the day. So you should be doing that. It's an education program. Should be absolutely essential, right? Let's do that. And But at the same time, of course, kids also spend a lot of time at home. And that's why they need a child benefit, right? Because they need a good environment to study. They need to get their breakfast, their evening meal. They need to buy clothes. So you need a child benefit as well. You need both, right? It's not an either or, and both can be done. And working together could be a great sort of a benefit. And free childcare. Another critical benefit that should be put in place in many countries to enable women to get into the task force. In Europe, the biggest impacts on child poverty don't come from the child benefits, they come from free childcare, because women are able to get back into the labor force and get a much higher income, and that's the biggest reduction in child poverty. Doesn't mean you shouldn't have the child benefits, you should have all of them. And how do you get them? That's the challenge.
Thank you so much again for sharing your thoughts. I will personally thank everyone here in the session, all the guest speakers and the participants. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. And I do want to finish with,
okay.
oh yes, one last thought. I'm not really answering a question, but I do want to mention it because there was a question about the global gateway, right?
Okay.
And whether, where does social protection sit in the global gateway? And many of us have seen it sit outside of the global gateway because right now the strategic priorities are more maybe towards other types of support or in partner countries. Having said that, social protection remains an enabler of the global gateway. It's part of the values. It's part of the way that we collaborate with our partner countries. It's part of our, it's part of our added value. And I think we ourselves, obviously, all the things that were mentioned about just transitions and greening the economies work also for the global gateway, where greening the green investments is obviously at the top. The same with digital investments, and we are increasingly working on digital social protection and making sure systems are interoperable, linked with IDs, linked with civil registration and vital statistics systems. So this is another big priority. And we're also very proud that we're, the last ones working on, not the last ones, but, we're still standing working on social issues and social inclusion and social protection. So we're very happy to be partnering with our colleagues working on inequality, especially for this session. So thank you.
Thank you.